50, left turn here at Echo 13.
Welcome. I'm Captain Greg Metler. I'm the chairman of the Contract Restoration Committee. I'd like to welcome you here. I appreciate everyone who made it here in spite of the computer short meltdown at Delta. We're really glad to have you here. We'd like to introduce Tim Kaplinger. He's in the back there. We'd like to thank him for supporting us. And there's going to be some books written about that guy someday. That'll be for sure. We want to thank all the Delta pilots that have contributed to DPA, who've given us the financial backing to make this event possible. The committee we have here, we have Vice Chairman Captain Carl Robbie. We have Captain Rich Lefferts. We'll introduce our honored guests later, Captain Steve Carter and Rob Chrissy's at the back door. That's our committee members. Unfortunately, as I said at the opening statements, with the meltdown, some of our guests couldn't make it, but it kind of makes this presentation a little bit prescient, because we'll talk about some of the issues where the money could have been going instead of where it is going. We got together because we saw an inconsistency in 20% net revenues at Delta and a lack of coalescing behind contracts that we had in days when 10% net revenue was just a completely great year. Now we've got 20% net revenues, and that doesn't even get us back to the contract we have. The only positions we see from ELPA, apologies to my ELPA members, are positions, gateway positions from the company. We want to see positions from the pilots. To introduce Ellen here, I can't really list everything that she's done. I'd be here for quite a while. She's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. She's won dozens of journalism awards, including 3 Polk Awards, 2 Loeb Awards, and a National Press Club Award. Retirement Heist, her landmark book, won the Helen Bernstein Book Award for Excellence in Journalism. So I'd like to introduce her, bring her up, and give her a warm welcome. Thank you very much.
We're here to find out what killed the Delta pilots' plan. The pilots suffered financial injuries of at least 40% of their pensions. The Northwest pilots have seen their plan put into the equivalent of a hangar in Alaska, where it's on ice. Before we get to the events that led to this, I wanted to give you an analogy to put it into perspective so that some of the financial information will make sense. I want you to imagine you're a peach farmer like Carl, and you have a peach farm with a number of employees. Your net revenue is great. You're paying yourself a good salary, great benefits. You had to negotiate with your employees because you could not afford to pay them as much as they wanted. So you said, all right, I'll give you 70% now and the other 30% later. So it's deferred, the deferred compensation. Now, business takes a nosedive. Maybe there's a drought, plague of locusts, and your expenses have gone up. So what do? Well, you do keep paying the people you need, the critical vendors, and you keep paying the other employees that you critically need, like the truck drivers, to get your peaches to wherever they need to go. But you stop paying the other folks. You borrow money. You continue to pay yourself. You continue to take good trips, put your kids through college. Finally, you reach a point where you really don't want to pay those pensions to those employees. In particular, the truck drivers, because they cost the most. You need them, but you really don't want to pay those pensions, that 30 or 40% of deferred pay that they have already earned. So you go to the bankruptcy judge and you say, listen, we can't afford to pay the truckers. If we do, we can't get lending to help us. We'll be forced to liquidate. That will have terrible consequences for the peach consumers and also for the economy of Happy Valley, where we live, because they'll lose jobs and the local economy will suffer. So the court says, all right, look, you can afford those pensions. Prove that you can't. So you hire lawyers and experts, and they go over your information. They have a lot of opportunity to make your liability look greater than it is. There's so many ways they can do that. Change discount rates, assumptions on returns. We'll come back to that. So they go into the court, and with them in the court, of course, all their family, including their wives that they've hired. You have your creditors who really do want you to dump that pension so that they can get paid. So the court says, all right, I understand, you have to liquidate it. Too bad, truck drivers. There's nothing you can do about it. So, meanwhile, your brother-in-law, Bob, in Utah, also has a peach farm, and he would like to merge it with yours so you can enjoy economies of scale. You have, meanwhile, protected your own pensions in secure trusts, and the merger goes through, and you make a lot more money. Your top guys make more money. But too bad for the truckers and the other truckers in Utah. So now we come to what we're here to talk about, which is why your plane crashed, basically. Now, Delta says it was a perfect storm. It was interest rates going down, which raises the liability. It was the market crash. It was 9/11. It was fuel costs. All of these sorts of things like weather and fuel and interest rates, which no one could possibly foresee would change. So that was an accident, they said. And who agreed? The shareholders agreed. We think it was an accident. Bankruptcy court agreed. The pilots, meanwhile, were looking more at the, they also tended to agree. They thought, well, it's the economy. It's those retired pilots that are causing our trouble. Or it's those active pilots who got a better deal. It's those Northwest guys. No, it's those Delta guys. I've even heard it's those ex-wives. So we have to look at the available data to see exactly what happened. You have to look in the black box for as much information as you can get. Now, we need to find out if the plan can be salvaged, if the Northwest plan can be thawed out, and this will be complicated. Because to continue the analogy, was this a mechanical failure on the part of the company? Was it too little fuel? Did they not fill up your planes with? Or were the planes overloaded with too many pilots who were too expensive? So to find this out, we have to look at the SEC filings that companies have to show what their total liabilities are. And we also have to look at the Labor Department filings, court transcripts of the bankruptcy, and sometimes the handouts from the company if they include technical details. What we're not using in this analysis are any consulting firm surveys or studies, because those are highly flawed and very biased in favor of the people who pay them to create the studies. We're not relying on handouts from ALPA or Delta beyond those that explain how the plan works, because I have seen a number of those handouts and they leave out some critical information. They say our liabilities are like this, but they're not including the interest rate and the other assumptions. They're not telling you how much went into the plan at critical times, because in critical times, and even in non-critical times, there wasn't much money going into the plan. And we're not looking at media reports, because they rely on the consultants. And there's no anecdotal evidence in here. This is all based on the data. And there's no hearsay, and it doesn't include anything that the pilots have told me in terms of the data. I've heard from you about the consequences and the problems, but this is all based on provable, actual facts. Now, to start with the problem that Delta and Northwest found themselves in, you have to look back into the early 90s. The 90s were a good time for pensions. The plans had become very overfunded, in some cases with billions of dollars, at most of the large companies. That was because there were tougher rules in the 80s, that were enacted to keep the pensions healthy. Employers were pulling too much money out. They were going through leverage buyouts, and the winners got the surplus and spent it. Also, the plans were overfunded because of the great market returns. So now you have plans with lovely surpluses. You would think that the companies would say, this is fantastic, we don't have to contribute, and we have a nice secure plan with a cushion, because maybe, in your case, Delta would say, gosh, the weather might get bad sometimes, it might snow, fuel costs might go up, there might be a crash. There are so many things that could happen, like, oh, your tech systems shut down your airline, and they would not possibly anticipate this, or the fact that the pilots are growing older and costlier because of their pay. So the plans were a very appealing piggy bank, and companies were able to tap them for billions of dollars. So we started with, as we see, the beginning, and 96 is where I start the Delta pension data. And you'll see that for the brief, happy, shining moment in 98 to 2000, there was a surplus. There was roughly $1 billion, as you can see, 1.5 in 2000, which was a good year for everyone. So behind the scenes, Delta was meeting with its consultants and lawyers. That's nothing sinister. All the companies do. And the consulting firms became more aggressive in the 90s. Far more aggressive. Initially, they started out as human resource consultants or actuaries that helped them figure out all the critical things they needed for their plan. But the consulting firms, the Towers Perrin, the Watson Wyatts, the Aons, Mercers, all developed a very strong business side, and their goal was to help employers get out of their retiree benefit obligations, including, obviously, the pensions, and the retiree medical, or anything that creates a liability that will hit their earnings currently, but also end up, it's a liability and money they'll have to pay out. They wanted to keep that money because there were so many ways to use it. Despite one of the strongest provisions in federal pension law, ERISA, that the benefits in a pension plan be used exclusively for the participants, for their exclusive use. There were so many ways around this, thanks to aggressive lobbying by employers and the consulting firms, to punch holes. They could use the assets to pay for restructuring. And I saw more evidence of this for Delta later, there was a $228 million amendment related to restructuring. With Northwest, there was $175 million. I can double check those figures. So they were doing it as well. Some companies like AT&T, IBM, they really, really pulled a lot out to pay for restructuring. And the reason that helped them is they don't have to use current cash flow, to pay severance. You can just use pension assets. The other thing they could do was use it for retiree health benefits. Again, a current cash savings. Now, this is at a time when the companies were also discovering how important it was to make their earnings look good in order to boost the executive compensation, which we'll come back to in a second. One of the biggest ways that companies siphoned money, and the consultants use that word, is by restructuring or mergers, spin-offs, acquisitions, in which they're able to monetize the assets, getting, they estimate, 80% on the dollar. And the way this works is if you're a company like GE and you want to sell something like a unit to Martin Marietta, what you can do is you can send over more surplus than is needed, and the company in exchange will take that into account with the purchase price. And it works the other way around. You have a company that has an underfunded plan, and it merges with a company that has an overfunded plan. It evens itself out, but again, they strike a deal. This was nicely illustrated in a transcript for one of the meetings of the Society of Actuaries, who meet every year. There's the enrolled actuaries and the Society of Actuaries. And happily, the transcripts for all of their meetings were preserved. They never thought someone might want to look at these and listen in. So I looked at them and listened in. And I saw things like the actuaries at one of their conferences in Maui, I think, having a little skit. And the skit was, all right, we know that the pension assets are solely for the benefit of participants, but we really want to get them out. What do? Well, in the merger, here's what we do. We don't write it down. We don't leave a paper trail. That way, we can't get into trouble. They're this blunt about it. And they also said, well, how can we adjust the liability? Because we might want to send more over or less over or assets. And they say, it's just the assumptions you use. Use assumptions that get you there. In fact, my favorite was using the 1951 mortality assumptions in one transaction. You can imagine, life expectancy being lower then. In any case, that was going on behind the scenes. The perfect storm wasn't necessarily the market and interest rates, particularly in the 90s. The perfect storm was companies discovering that they could use their pension plans to manage earnings. By raising or lowering the discount rate by even a small amount, you can increase the liability by $1 billion or decrease it by $1 billion. And that is something that all companies did. And subsequent research shows that companies would naturally reduce their interest rates to increase their liabilities during, as you can think, what times? Well, it would be before contract negotiations. If you go through the history and you suddenly find that there's a jump in liability, it is usually caused by, obviously, the discount rate. And it can also be caused by the change in expected return on the assets. So the year before a collective bargaining or a merger or a bankruptcy, you adjust the interest rate and other assumptions, and you get that liability as high as possible. And I did see that in Delta's case. The reason you want to do that even without those extreme conditions is it generates income to the penny that you might need when you're at a crucial earnings target. Why do we care? Well, the perfect storm was not only the accounting rules, which were so flexible that companies could really use that plan to manage earnings. This occurred at the same time that executive compensation was becoming extremely important to companies. Again, the same consulting firms were showing them, the employers, how they could increase executive compensation using earnings targets, stock awards. You can imagine how the timing of your earnings rise and fall would be affected by the interests of the executives. It could make a difference of millions of dollars. So that was going on using the pension assumptions. And this was creating an incredible liability at companies because executives were not only getting higher pay currently, but they could defer much of it or have it in a SERP, a Supplemental Executive Retirement Plan. So you had these SERPs growing and growing in liability. And when I looked at it at the time of the Delta bankruptcy, many of the companies were running in excess of $1 billion. You know, the Pfizers, the ExxonMobils, certainly the banks. And so you have billions owed to executives. And this is hidden because they don't have to break it out. In the pension footnotes, it's aggregated with your pensions. So the Delta management liabilities are impossible to see. They're part of those totals. So when companies say, look at our growing pension obligations, well, that includes a lot of executives in there. And rarely can you break it out. Only in a few cases did I see the non-qualified compensation liabilities broken out in the SEC filings. You can't ask the company to give it to you. They'll say, we don't have to. Some of this information goes to the PBGC, but in a deal in 1998, I believe, the employers, it was 96, employers convinced the PBGC, we don't really, you know, if you want it, it's confidential. You can't release it to anyone, so you can't get it. At the same time, they convinced the PBGC to stop its 50 worst list of underfunded plans. The last one that was published was, I think, in 96, and it included Delta and Northwest. So they've always been in that mix. So now you have non-qualified, i.e. executive liabilities, even more hidden. The other way to hide them, of course, was just to hide what the compensation is. And you do have those footnotes in the tables in the proxies that tell you, you know, so-and-so Mullins got this in salary, he got this many stock options, and it looks like he has this amount. You have to go through so many calculations to figure out what someone actually gets. Just one example, this is not a Delta example, this is Jack Welsh at GE. In his compensation table, which shows he received above market interest on his savings account, you know how that is, you might have a 401k and you get a return of a certain interest rate. Well, the executives could get a higher return on their deferred comp. So it's said that he received $1.2 million in above market income. To find out what it was really worth, you had to go to a footnote 5. That would take you to an SEC Reg SK item 402B2, which took you to Revenue Ruling 20158 table, which takes you to another exhibit, which takes you to the math. And when you do the math, that 1.2 million becomes 2.5. And that's just for above market interest, which is a pretty simple thing. This is not all the other complicated stuff, the sorts of things that Bill Lazanik is an expert in. All the stock options, the awards. Now that this is all growing and the liability is growing, it's not only creating a liability that makes the pension plan of the regular employees look less healthy, But it's hitting earnings harder because the obligations are joined up with the regular pension plans, but there's no funding because companies don't get tax breaks. Because there's no funding and no assets to offset the liability, it hits earnings harder. In some cases like AT&T, 50% of the pension cost in certain years was for the executives. 50%. And I believe they had 173,000 employees in their pension plans. So management was getting or accounting for 50% of the hit to earnings. But there's no way that most people would be able to find that out. So not only do you have a case where companies have an incentive to cut the retiree benefits, but they can argue that the plans are more underfunded than they are because they don't back out the executive liability, and they blame costly pensions. I've heard this over and over. A company blames costly pensions, but nobody is taking out the non-qualified, the management pensions. Even the analyst surveys that show the pension liabilities and assets for companies, and here's what the funding levels are, that does not back out the liabilities for the executives. I found that with GE, at one point, they had $7 billion in surplus, but it was considered, but you had to back out $1.4 billion for the executives. The executives accounted for like $1 in 8. AT&T, the same. IBM, the same. What they all have in common is they froze their pension plans because of their costly employees. So when you freeze a plan, it actually helps because it stops the qualified, i.e. the, say, pilots' pensions from growing in liability. But it gives more wiggle room to the executive liability. The fact that companies could manage their earnings so well and pull money out of their plans when they were doing it enabled them to sort of raise and lower their expectations. They replenished the assets in the plans by cutting benefits, as we saw, freezing plans. If your plan becomes less well-funded because you've pulled money out, then what you need to do is cut benefits. This explains why so many companies in the 90s were frantically cutting benefits, even when they had massive surpluses. And I didn't understand this, obviously, initially, when I saw IBM report that, oh, it's going to come out with a new pension plan that's better for people. It's more modern, it's portable, and it's going to save us $200 million. So I asked IBM, how is it going to save you $200 million? You're already way overfunded. You don't have to put money in. Companies like GE were on a funding holiday since the 1980s. I don't believe GE ever put a dime into their pension plan, maybe a few dimes in the late 2000s. But the other companies, no. So they would not explain it. They just said, well, it's just that way. So ultimately I figured out what it was they were cutting pensions, and when you cut pensions, that reduces the liability, which generates gains that go into earnings. The reason why, they wouldn't tell me, and the reason why people didn't know, even all those engineers at IBM, was because companies deliberately hid this maneuver. They told people their pensions were worth the same or better, and they weren't. They were hiding the cuts. Offering lump sums was one of the primary ways to cut benefits without people knowing, because you would calculate it differently when you paid it out. Nobody hires an actuary and says, is my lump sum calculated appropriately? Oddly, the rules that say you can't cut back pensions, i.e. anti-cutback rules, which say you have to pay people what they have earned. You cannot take away that portion that they have earned. If the employee cuts their own plan by unknowingly taking a lump sum that's worth less, no anti-cutback rule has been violated. So companies enjoyed that for a while. There were waves of cash balance conversions. Obviously, there are some plans in the airlines. And I do doubt that the people who were agreeing to those changes understood the impact, because mostly the employees didn't in various places. So you have those cuts taking place, and meanwhile, we hit the bad times. Okay, the bad times come, the 2000s, and you can see how the liability grew here. It just kept going up, and that's because of a number of things: investment losses and changes in the interest rate assumptions. When the bad times hit, companies said they were shocked, shocked to discover gambling going on in Casablanca. And they, of course, pointed to 9/11, they pointed to the market, the dot-com bubble bursting, expensive pilots, and so forth. So companies were pleading with people, or actually enforcing the cuts to benefits. Happily, at Delta, that wasn't the case for a number of people on the top. Delta, at the bad time, set up secure trusts for top management, and they funded them with, at this point, $33 million. These trusts were not only protected from bankruptcy, because they were not, obviously they're not part of the regular pension plan. They're a trust fund with provisions that spring the assets if there's a bankruptcy. Because executive pensions are protected. They don't lose them, unlike you. What also made these trusts different was their compensation was replaced at as much as 100%. Yours had a 60% target, the management had 100%. Oh, and they could withdraw in a lump sum of cash within 3 days of receiving it. So, obviously, a different situation. I have a list of the people who were in the plan and what they received. 4 of the lawyers: Coleman, $2.1 million, Terry Eskin, $1.3, Vicky Escara, $1.6, Robert Harley, $2.5, Mullen, of course, $8.2. This was taking place at a time when things were nosediving. Now we can see the whole range, I hope. Can they see that? So if you look at the red line for obligations, you'll see that they went up steeply. They ran up very steeply at the time right before the run-up to the plan termination in 2005. The company was starting to say, we have to do something. Their interest rates were going down steadily, which of course increased the liability, because you need more money in the present if you're assuming a low interest rate going forward. So every year, starting in 2001, the interest rates fell. They started at 7.75%, then went to 5.69, 5.88. 5.69 was the lowest, and that was 2005, and that was just before the merger. So that boosted liability in the billions, I believe. The only way you could find out exactly how they were measuring the level of assets was if you hired an actuary who could go through the calculations. The rates of expected returns can change every year. These things get muddied up by fiscal year changes. They can put aside gains and losses on the sidelines and sort of sprinkle them in when they need. They can change mortality assumptions, which they did, and assumptions about future salary increases. Mere mortals cannot really keep track of that. You would think that as the company's pension became less healthy, they would contribute more. But if you look at the bottom line here, the zero, the amount of contributions, if you put it in and charted it, would be like almost at that bottom line. You think it sounds high if they say 300 million. People are thinking 300 million, that's big. You have to put it in the context of billions. And if you do, that's where it would run. So we don't have a good contribution history ever at the airlines, Northwest or Delta. So when we get to the really bad times, the company, of course, says, we've got to get rid of this plan. Now, the problem for the pilots is you can't tell at the time how much money the company is contributing to your plan. Same thing with Northwest, because this is disclosed in separate 5,500 filings that go to the Labor Department every year, but you don't get that information for as much as 2 years. So it's 2 years out of date. To give you an example, the U.S. Air pilots were unaware that their plan was in trouble. They thought it was great up to a month before the company filed for permission to terminate the plan. And that's because they could not or did not get the information about it. They couldn't tell if management was starving the plan, which it subsequently acknowledged that it did. It had not been contributing to the pilot's plan, but was contributing to the other plans. When they went into bankruptcy court, U.S. Airways had hired Towers Perrin and other experts to testify at how huge the liability was. And the bankruptcy judge listened to this and goaded them a bit. PBGC said, no, it's not that bad. Well, who was on the management side in these arrangements? Creditors want to see the plan killed. Anyone who's loaned them money wants to see the plan killed. The ATSB was on the company's side for that arrangement. There's no one standing up for the pilots except the pilots and PBGC, pretty much. When they went into court, their actuary, the pilots, had so little time to prepare because this bankruptcy was fast-tracked, and it was a month from filing to when it went into court. Their actuary requested the needed documents, the 5,500s, for the pilot's plan, and a few days before the hearing, the company sent him a bunch of the plans, except the pilots. So he requested it again. And the day before the hearing, he did get the pilot's plan for the wrong year. So he went into court to argue their case without the information that he needed. And what's really sad is that the court said, well, those pilots based their calculation rules on, rough estimates, while the U.S. Airways actuary based his on the actual computer model used for administrating the plan. And when I asked U.S. Air about this, their spokesman said it was quite clear that we had made reasonable assumptions and the lack of credibility of the plaintiff's witness was obvious. This didn't seem to bother the bankruptcy judge. I don't have enough details about what went on at the Delta bankruptcy. I did look at comments that Mr. Bastian made in the hearing, and again he was arguing, using the data he'd been supplied with, that the plan was, totally, on its deathbed. It had to be killed or the company would liquidate. He said, if that happens, think of the jobs, it'll hurt the economy, all those poor passengers will be stranded. As you know, the plan was killed. Subsequently, there was a critical change in the funding rules, which Delta had been arguing for. Had they waited a few months, they would have been able to take advantage of the changes under the PPA, a Pension Protection Act, which would have enabled them to use a more favorable discount rate, and to stretch payments out longer. But they pushed through the termination before that happened. So they couldn't take advantage of that. They could have done other things apart from killing the plan. They could have used more reasonable assumptions. They could have delayed the termination. They absolutely could have, but they did not. So they left a huge liability behind them and emerged from bankruptcy, as always is the case, in better financial shape. Shareholders are thrilled, executives are thrilled, creditors are thrilled. You're not thrilled because of what's happened to you. So now that the pilot's plan is no longer the scapegoat, the Delta plan, because they can't say, oh, look, it's hurting our earnings. The primary scapegoat I keep hearing about is the government. Like when you argue, we have to get our plan back, you have to do something, reestablish it. The company says the government won't let us. They have rules that would require us to fund this or fund that if we, for Northwest case, if we unfreeze the plan, or if we wanted to establish a plan for the Delta pilots to make up for what they lost, the court, the IRS might say, no, we won't let you do that because of X, Y, and Z rules. X, Y, and Z rules are always waived when companies go in and say, waive this, please. They don't even try to get these so-called impediments removed because naturally it is not to their advantage. So now they use the pension obligation in general, the Northwest, as a scapegoat. And we see a disturbing trend, which is, again, the contributions are very low. They did increase as much as like $900 million at one point, but it's nowhere near to taking care of the funding, even when the companies had very high returns. So continued lack of funding, continued increase in obligations at a time when we're poised soon to see interest rates start rising, finally. And when interest rates rise, the liability will come down by billions of dollars. Simple. When it does, the plans will be better funded. So with the extension of the funding changes, and if they had waited, they wouldn't have this kind of liability for the pilots or for the other plans, because they could have slowly funded and waited for interest rates to change and maybe stopped that executive liability from growing so high, and they would have been in shape to preserve the plan. And if you are wondering about the priorities of the company, you look at the fact that the obligation is at like $20 billion now, and that includes getting rid of Delta pilots and freezing the Northwest plan. What's going on? Again, you need to hire actuaries to question every single claim that the company makes about their liabilities. You need to look at how much money they're putting in every year, get the 5,500 filings, look at them for all of the plans, especially the Northwest plan, because the Northwest plan is the most costly. Now, the other thing we know for sure, including the fact that discount rates will go up, is we know that there will be bad weather. We know that people will get older. We know there could be a war. Fuel costs could go up. All of these things could happen. And when they get big enough, the liability gets large enough, because maybe we're not funding well enough, whatever, that Northwest pilot frozen plan is going to look pretty tempting. If you think, well, that won't happen for a while, we're looking forward, look forward 20 years. You'll be alive in 20 years. You'll be getting a pension from that frozen plan. So are you really confident that with a pension plan run by the company, even if it's frozen now, that you can count on the benefits. I would really look closely at the plan, the way it's run. I would ask very strong questions of the company about their investing, the investment returns, the assumptions about them, and many of the other things I'm talking about. You have to look at where they're allocating their cash. Where are they allocating cash flow? Yeah, and why aren't they contributing more to the pensions? Because the pensions are not a gratuity. They're not something that they, nice that you had them and too bad that they're gone. This is compensation that was negotiated, is in a contract. The country is built on contracts. If we just decided we don't want to have contracts because we don't feel like it, obviously, things wouldn't be able to run. So we had motive, we had opportunity, and we had means to adjust the plans in ways that were favorable to the company, but not to you. So going forward, with the claims that the company makes about why they can't set up some kind of replacement, you would need to hire experts in the law and in the plan structure, because you need to look at that as well, and actuaries. That's costly. It would require a lot of upfront investment. But we're talking about potentially a great deal of money for you in retirement. And if you're not comfortable with the notion that a DB plan will always be there, thinking about other types of arrangements that might help make up for what you have lost. The company says, it's too complicated to figure that out. There's something called a computer and computer programs. If they can do all of this in mergers and change all the interest rates assumptions and time it so executives get more and the plan gets more costly before you go into contract negotiations, if they can do all that with all the pilots, with all their different kind of pay structures and ages and potential retirement dates, I think they could come up with a plan that would be secure and that they could afford, that could try and make this up. Because your 401k is not going to do that. It's not going to do that. If you're 25, maybe it'll do that. If your salary's good and you put some money aside and you don't have college tuition and mortgage payments and medical bills. But it's possible in some ways. And the question for you is to talk to plan designers about what could be done to set aside tax-qualified money that you aren't paying taxes on currently, like an IRA, and that is secure because it's in a separate account for you. If it's a separate account, the company can't take it. It's not in their hands. And that way it's secure. And you have to question, are they just going to put company stock into it because company stock is not the best investment? It goes down. When a company goes down, and you might not be around to see it go back up. You get locked into it. Often this is the case with ESOP arrangements, which your company has to finance your profit sharing. The book that I wrote goes into how ESOPs are not set up for you. They are set up to benefit the company. It's a way to borrow money cheaply. It's too technical to get into. But a lot of companies do it. They claim it's for the benefit of employees. There are so many ways that companies benefit from all the different types of retirement plans that you have that you have no idea about. Floor offset arrangements. You have a MP3 plan, that's a money purchase plan that is established to essentially pay the amount that you can't receive in the regular pension because it's above IRS limits. So the assets in that grow, and they're supposed to offset what your hypothetical amount would be above that limit and pay for it. Most floor offset arrangements I've seen are a bit gimmicky. I would have someone look at that plan very closely. well, it's too late now, but if the company says, how about a floor offset? How about an ESOP? How about this new fangled plan like a, cash balance or something? You've got to hire experts to look at it. You've got to get your union. You've got to get ALPA, if they will. If they won't, get somebody else. Get another union to do it, because you can't do this on your own, and you can't rely on ALPA, from what I've seen. And again, that's the only anecdotal part of this presentation. I have only to go on what you have told me, but also I see in the bankruptcy filings, ALPA was like, sure, kill the plan. And the pilots sort of agreed because they didn't know what was going on. ALPA should have known. They should have asked questions all along from any kind of compensation arrangement that included deferrals. And that includes things like retiree health, because that's an obligation also. It's something you're earning by working that will be paid to you in the future, but it's also a liability that is unfunded, so it hits earnings hard. And by the way, one way that companies finance their executive liabilities is they create a separate fund. We're not talking about the secure trust for the very top, but they create a separate tax advantage fund by buying life insurance, which has the same type of accounting that pensions have, or at least in terms of the tax qualified status. So they can put a ton of money in the life insurance contracts, and it grows tax deferred. Problem is, you're only supposed to buy life insurance if you have an interest in the person's life in some way, that you would be harmed if they died. So what companies did was they bought billions of dollars of life insurance on the employees' lives. So I don't know if Delta has done this, because companies don't disclose it, and when I started writing about it, they stopped really disclosing it. The only way you can tell is with banks, because banks have to disclose their insurance purchases. So if you look at certain bank filings, you can see what the billions of dollars are that they have on their employees. So most of the big companies have these, and when workers die, the death benefit doesn't go to the widows and orphans, it goes to the company. The company doesn't really care so much about the money they're going to get when you die. It likes the fact that it's got all this tax-sheltered money. Well, if they can do that for executive compensation to offset the cost, I don't know, I'm getting fanciful here, but why not you? Anything you see that's done to help finance and protect executive pensions, ask yourself, why not you? So if you really are serious about getting your retirement benefits restored, you do have to ask these questions. You have to maybe not rely on ALPA for some of the answers. You need your own people.
Okay, first of all, I'd like to thank Ellen. That was an incredible presentation. I'm struck by the fact that there are people like Bill and Ellen out in the academic world and in the business world that are supporting people like us that they don't even know, and they really help us stand up for when they see injustice, and they're standing up, placing their careers on the line for these types of things. What I get from this is one thing is the going forward provisions. I can pretty much guarantee that the financial model that DPA has will have plenty of capital for supporting and paying for the experts for going forward models for the retirements provisions that she mentioned. Also, I'm getting from this that Delta did not wait for the 17-year provisions to come in for our retirements, that they increased their obligations, and they didn't look at viable alternatives, manipulation, another third target, manipulation of financial mechanisms for personal wealth and for company bottom line materials. So I think that's an incredible assessment. I think it's something that we need to pay attention to. Oh, I got it right here, I think. Yes, ma'am.
Yes. I've heard a lot of talk about who should not have received lump sums, and whether the retired guys get a better deal or the active guys. That's water under the bridge. And I'll tell you, it's not their fault. You know, people who retired when they did, that was a smart move. I mean, seriously? If you were able to do that and you knew that the pension was going to be terminated, you would have done that. It is not their fault. And the fact that the lump sums were going out the door isn't what hurt the plan. It didn't help the asset levels, but it did take the liability down by the exact amount that the money went out. So it balances out. So don't blame each other, don't blame the lump sums, don't waste time on that, because that's not going to get you anywhere, and you're blaming the wrong people. You have to just put your energy in places where you can achieve something for yourselves.